I'm really excited to be here. I am always happy to present at the Third Friday training events and any of the other events going on around the state for the various task forces and other organizations that are all invested in the anti-trafficking work. We're all doing this. We're all doing this. We're all working to end human trafficking in our own way, in our own corner of the universe, and in whatever way we can contribute. So there's room for everybody in this fight. There's room for everybody here. Everybody brings their own unique set of talents and time, and I'm just happy that everybody can be here. So yes, and I've got my presentation up. Can someone just drop it in the chat and tell me, yes, you can see my title slide with human trafficking and juvenile justice? Okay, hearing some yeses. Excellent. Thank you. And I've seen some familiar names come up in the chat. I've seen some colleagues from the Department of Juvenile Justice. So yay, representing from my own agency. I've seen colleagues from the Department of Corrections. I've seen colleagues from Florida Department of Law Enforcement, from several different child protection investigation units across the state. And oh, there's another colleague from the Department of Health. So this is all absolutely exciting. We've got a pretty good group here today. So, and if you haven't signed in using the chat, just to tell everybody who you are and where you're from. I love to see this and know where folks are coming from. And it helps give me a better idea of who's there so I can better tailor the presentation to the people that are here. So, so let me go ahead, in case we haven't seen it already, in case it's not up on the website, I'm going to go ahead and drop the handout into the chat. And as I go along, I will, if I mention information coming from a particular website, I'll make sure to drop it in the chat for you so that you can go directly to where I'm getting this information. So you with me? We're here. We got this. It is Friday afternoon. It is a beautiful day in Tallahassee. The weather is about perfect, and I am psyched and ready to be here. So yes, so as Robin mentioned, yes, I'm Dr. Katherine Gomez. I serve as the Human Trafficking Intervention Director at the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice. I've served in this position since 2018, but I've served the state of Florida since 2006. And as Robin mentioned, I worked my way up from being a probation officer and then a specialized probation officer before I moved into more of the research and data and administrative pieces of this. So I'm very grateful to serve the people of Florida, and I'm very grateful to work in this capacity. And I'm grateful to work at an agency that really prioritizes intervention for human trafficking. So we already mentioned some of the housekeeping things. Please feel free to drop the questions in the chat. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat, and if I see a question come through that I can real quick answer, I'll be happy to do that. And if there's a question that we need to hold off a minute and answer a little bit later, I am happy to hold off and answer it a little later. Attendance is monitored. You will get your certificate at the end, as they mentioned at the beginning. So let's real quick hit the Human Trafficking 101. Most of the folks that attend these training series are very well versed in human trafficking, but there's always a few people that come to these training events that this is their very first training. This is their first time learning about human trafficking, very first time with any of these things. So always want to make sure that we bring everybody together and put everybody on the same page. So, and you know, as Robin mentioned, yes, I really try to be survivor-centered, survivor-focused, include the voices of survivors in all of my policy making, training, anything that I do. I try to make sure that the voices of survivors are included. And so, what better way to start out a presentation, right? So, a quote from a survivor is, "My story matters, but it doesn't define me." And one of the things I like about this particular quote is that there's a lot of survivors that are out there that work alongside us as our colleagues. They're knowledgeable, they're professional, they work right alongside us. And every once in a while, sometimes we get a little bit too focused on the fact that they have lived experience. And we ask about their lived experience all the time. And we ask for them to talk about their lived experience all the time. And we ask them to go ahead and talk about some of a really difficult time in their life. And sometimes survivors are open to doing that. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're open in certain contexts, but not in others. But we have to remember that the colleagues that work alongside us that have lived experience are our colleagues. We wouldn't necessarily ask any of our coworkers about really personal, difficult times in their life. So we try to be respectful to the colleagues that work right alongside us as all of our professionals. So let's just real quick start with an international lens and then move our way down to a local lens, because human trafficking is something that happens all around the world, even though my little sliver of the universe is Florida and the United States of America, and specifically juvenile justice within Florida. But internationally, let's just go with a real quick international definition. So the international definition is, there's lots of different types of definitions for human trafficking, but we'll go with the simplest and easiest one. So recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by improper means, such as force, abduction, fraud, or coercion, for an improper purpose, including forced labor or sexual exploitation. Sometimes we get a little bit hung up on the word abduction, and we think that all types of human trafficking happen through abduction. But in reality, abduction is one of the least common ways that individuals make it into the trafficking life, but I'll come back to that in just a minute. The most common types of trafficking, there's many different kinds of trafficking that are out there, especially if you move all the way up to the international lens. But the most common types that we see and the most common types that we talk about are sexual exploitation and forced labor. And we always want to make sure that we put a distinction on what is trafficking versus what is smuggling, because we want to make sure that we understand that trafficking and smuggling are sometimes similar and sometimes go hand in hand. Maybe even in a particular case, an individual might be trafficked and smuggled, or smuggled and trafficked. But those two things are very different things. So trafficking is a crime against a person. Smuggling is a crime against a nation. A individual can be trafficked, and that is a exploitation of that individual person, and you don't have to move that person from point A to point B. You don't have to move that person across state lines. You don't have to move people across international boundaries. You don't have to move people from point A to point B. So I want to make sure that we keep those clear. So a simple example of this could be an individual could be smuggled from one country to another country, right? And that can be something that is voluntary. A person would like to move from country A to country B and would like to be smuggled across a border from country A to country B. That's not necessarily trafficking. Now, when we're talking about trafficking, why is that person moving from country A to country B? Are they moving because they've been promised job opportunities in country B, and those job opportunities may not even come to fruition? That person's labor may be exploited, that person's labor may be forced or coerced, and that person may not be paid exactly what it is that they've been promised to be paid. That's where we start talking about the trafficking of that person. The movement of that person across a border is the smuggling piece. The trafficking is that trickery, that exploitation, that force or fraud or coercion, or some way exploiting that person's labor when it shouldn't. So let's just take all of that from the international lens. Let's take it down to the national lens. Let's go with the United States. So the United States definition is pretty simple, pretty easy to understand, and uses some of the same words. The recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, soliciting, or advertising of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Force, fraud, or coercion, we're going to come back to that in just a minute. But it's our definitions in the United States have an extra little detail to it, that sex trafficking does not require there to be force, fraud, or coercion if the victim of that sex trafficking is under 18 years of age. So put that in the back of your mind, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. When we talk about sex trafficking of children, of minors, anybody under the age of 18, what we're talking about is commercial sexual exploitation of a child, or CSEC, because this is government, this is, we love acronyms where we are. And CSEC is a very simple term. Well, it's a longer term, honestly, but a simple acronym that talks about a range of different crimes that involve sexual abuse of a child in exchange for anything of value. So those are pretty simple national definitions. What about in Florida? In Florida, Section 787.06 of Florida statutes lays out all of the different definitions of all the various crimes of human trafficking. And there's a few different highlights that we have in there. So we have labor trafficking of adults and children. That's all included in the definitions of human trafficking. We have definitions of sex trafficking for adults and for children, and we don't necessarily specify that in order to be a sex trafficking victim, you have to be a child, or in order to be a sex trafficking victim, you have to be an adult. We include adults and children in all of the various anti-trafficking statutes that we have in Florida, because we recognize that trafficking happens to adults and children. And we lay out commercial sexual exploitation of children That's a really common term that we use, that CSEC term, but in terms of our statutes and how we go forth and how we investigate, prosecute, and work with those cases, it all falls into the category of human trafficking. And then at the local level, take a look at what's going on around you. Different municipalities around the state of Florida have enacted different local statutes to try to cut down on anti-trafficking in that particular area of the universe, or the state. Universe, state, it's all the same thing. We're good. So so there's lots of different things. So take a look around where you are and what your particular corner of the universe has done. So when we talk about the trafficking, to make sure that we hit the details there, and I'm looking to see if there's any questions that have come in. Nope, I don't see any questions. Lots of people still signing in, so thank you. And I see one question that came in a little bit earlier about, do we have statistics by county? We do have statistics by county, but we don't have them in this particular presentation. So if you want to reach out to me via email afterwards, I'm happy to talk through any of that later. There's also some pretty decent statistics that are published online, and you're welcome to pull them down, but you are more than welcome to reach out to me later. So when
Katherine,
we're talking, yeah, go ahead, Robin.
let me tell you too, I just put something in the chat about that too, that DCF does have data as well. But again, it's just a challenge. It's one of the biggest challenges we have in finding involved, human trafficking involved statistics.
So true. So true. So, okay, so here we go. We have our process. We'll talk about each of these individually. So process, what we're talking about is, which one of these things is this person doing? Are they inducing, recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining? What exactly is happening? Are they coercing somebody? Are they inducing somebody? Are they luring somebody? Are they transporting somebody from point A to point B? What is going on with the process, and how are they doing it? Are they using force or fraud or coercion? And what is the end? Are they doing it for labor or for sexual exploitation? So specifically, how exactly is this happening? What's going on? Is it the recruitment? Is it the harboring? Is it force, fraud, or coercion? But there's a really important detail on that, and that's that force, fraud, and coercion is not required for sex trafficking when the victim is under 18 years of age. So that's an important detail to throw in there. We do run into cases within the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice where an individual who's under the age of 18 might say, well, I'm okay with what's happening to me. I support this. I'm all right with this. I'm okay with the money that I'm making and the abuse that's happening with me. This is not something that I'm being forced into. And in the eyes of the law, that's not a thing. You can't do this voluntarily when someone is under the age of 18. Anybody under the age of 18, regardless of whether they believe that they are okay with what's going on, anybody under the age of 18 is a trafficking victim. And then what is the end? What is the point? Why is this person being recruited? Why is this person being transported? What types of force, fraud, or coercion are happening with this person? What is the purpose of it? The purpose is to either exploit that person for labor, exploit that person for sex, or sometimes exploit that person for both. And then when we talk a little bit about the three different people that are involved in trafficking, there typically are three different folks that we have to point out. There is the trafficker, there is the victim, and there is the buyer, right? So the victim is the person who is being exploited. The trafficker is typically a third-party person, which could be a parent, could be a romantic partner, could be an employer, could be anything like that, who is providing that victim for that particular exploitation. And then there is the buyer, who is the person that would like to purchase the exploitation of that person, who would like to purchase the commercial sex from that person, who would like to purchase the forced labor of that person. And so typically in any type of commercial sex transaction or labor exploitation transaction, there are three different people: trafficker, buyers, and victims. But there's another caveat to that, just to be careful. Traffickers and buyers can be the exact same thing when we're talking about children and when we're talking about commercial sexual exploitation of children. So take that example I used a moment ago for that 17-year-old who thinks, well, I'm okay with what's happening to me and nobody's forcing me to do this. Well, the person in that particular situation that can be prosecuted potentially as a trafficker is that that person who is a buyer. They can also be prosecuted as a trafficker. Every person's situation is just a little bit different and just a little bit unique, of course, but traffickers and buyers can be the exact same person. You don't have to have a third party. There doesn't have to be a parent that's forcing this child into commercial sex. You don't have to have an older boyfriend or a girlfriend or other kind of romantic partner that's forcing this child into commercial sex. Traffickers and buyers can be the same people. So a couple of simple and easy examples just to make it a little bit more concrete. So easy example of labor trafficking, a child who's forced to work on a farm because their family owes money to their employer. The child is the victim there. That person is being forced for their labor and their family owes money to an employer. Simple, easy, makes sense. Here's an example of CSEC. So a parent who allows a landlord to sexually abuse their child in exchange for rent forgiveness. We're talking about a child who is the victim, a parent who in this particular situation is acting as a trafficker. And we're talking about the item of value, which is rent forgiveness. So allowing the sexual abuse of the child in exchange for payment of that rent, right? Another example of labor trafficking, and this is one of the newer types of trafficking that we talk about, which is more of the forced criminality types of trafficking. So a child who shoplifts and sells stolen items online because their parent threatens to kick them out and report them missing to their juvenile probation officer, like I was a juvenile probation officer, threatens to kick them out and report them missing to their juvenile probation officer if they don't pay their portion of the rent. So that can be an example of forcing that child to engage forcing that child to engage in the illegal labor markets going on and forcing that child to commit crimes as a way to exploit the child and pay the rent. The item of value is paying rent. So let's see. So here's another CSEC example here. So a 30-year-old individual who arranges online to meet a 15-year-old child for sex in exchange for dinner and paying the child's cell phone bill. And then here's another example, which I've alluded to a little bit already. So 17-year-old runaway child who has posted an online advertisement offering sexual activity in exchange for transportation to a neighboring town. Transportation is the item of value here, right? It doesn't even have to be offering money or something or some other tangible item of value. Offering transportation can be a item of value. So before I get into common risk factors, let me take a look and see what I have in the chat. Okay, so there's a question about Amber Alerts and missing child alerts on the phones. Are there any agencies that do human trafficking alerts? That's a great question. And that actually ties right into this next slide. So I'm going to answer that one with the next slide, because missing kids and runaway kids are often very much at risk for trafficking and exploitation. So sometimes the Amber Alerts that you might see may very well involve trafficked children, and missing child alerts may very well involve trafficked children. But I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then I see another question that asks that, are there any safe houses for those removed from labor trafficking? And are there any safe houses specifically for male victims? Those are, that's also another great question. And it really depends on where in the country and where in the state you're talking about. There are safe houses that are out there, and many safe houses cater to victims of commercial sexual exploitation, but can also work with young people who have experienced exploitation of all different varieties. And go ahead, Robin.
Yeah, I was going to say too, the questioner doesn't say necessarily that just for youth. So that is a question for sure. That's different, but I was going to share what we do here in Tallahassee and in our area is a lot of the labor trafficking, male labor trafficking victims don't need to be in safe houses. They need rental assistance. They need a place to stay. They might need some first and last rents, things like that, or transitional housing, or even more permanent housing. So it's kind of a thing to understand where the survivor is and what they need and where they need support services. So that's another thing to keep in mind in terms of labor. We've found actually most of the labor trafficking survivors that we've worked with don't need to be in house, congregate housing.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. And it's pretty similar with the young people that we work with as well, that many young people can remain at home safely. And if they do need to be removed from their home, there's many different options of places that young people can go and receive some services and some treatment that doesn't necessarily have to be a safe house. So let me see, are there any more questions that came in here? A few other things that came in. All right. And welcome to the people that have just joined. So glad to see you.
And we do, let me just say this too, if you don't
Hmm.
mind, Catherine,
Sure.
I'll just
Go ahead.
pop in. This is a little different than usual, but
We're
let me
good.
just respond. And I did put it in the chat, but I'll put it in again. This presentation, your PowerPoint, and we may have some ancillary materials that you'll be referring to. We're going to
Mhm.
put all that up on the Stack website. And I'm going to put it up in the chat again. You can go here and you can see not only this program, but past programs that we've done, which really is something that you can do. And we're also thinking about getting ready to turn some of these into podcasts. I'm just uh, giving you that little extra hint, but know that this program will be available, everybody. Katherine just put the PowerPoint up again, but you'll be able to listen and share this with others. And it takes a few days for us to get it up there, but just go to the surviveandthriveadvocacy.org website and you'll be able to hear this program.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And excellent. And thanks again, Robin. I like this tag team. This is great. So let me get back to this. So we're talking about some common risk factors there. Now, let's be real. There's a lot of common risk factors for trafficking. And one of the common underpinnings is vulnerability at the end of the day. So young people who may have experienced abuse, or maybe are experiencing homelessness, or maybe are experiencing poverty, or have some type of disability, somebody who's part of a sexually marginalized population, maybe they're part of the LGBTQIA population, somebody who's struggling with substance use or substance misuse, or lowered inhibitions that maybe go along with a family that has been engaged in the commercial sex industry in the past, and young people who have gone through many different kinds of adverse childhood experiences. And of course, there are many, many different kinds of risk factors, many more risk factors, honestly, than we can even really put in one particular slide. But if you think about it, vulnerability is the key, right? And some of the most vulnerable young people that we work with maybe have ended up in the dependency system in some way, maybe have ended up in the child welfare system in some way, maybe are in foster care, maybe have been temporarily sheltered to stay with a family related caregiver or something like that. But not every young person who has experienced exploitation is a young person who's involved in the foster care system. And there's plenty of young people who are exploited, both their labor is exploited and sex is exploited, for young people that are living right at home. So that's another detail to throw in there. That's foster care is very common for young people who are exploited, but by no means a requirement. So one thing that's interesting, though, that kind of goes back to that about runaway youth or homeless youth or Amber Alerts or something like that. Some common statistics that we come across, and these are coming from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So one of the common stats that we talk about sometimes is that young people who are reported missing and missing to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which if you think about it, if you're being reported to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, you may very well potentially be a missing and exploited child that's being reported. But one of the details that NCMEC, or the common acronym for National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, they estimate that about 15% of the young people that are missing may very well be victims of some kind of trafficking, and they specifically say sex trafficking. And I put that particular resource PDF in the chat if anybody would like to go to that and see that. And another statistic that we talk about sometimes is taking a look at young people who are homeless or have run away or have been asked to leave their home. And sometimes about a third of them are recruited into trafficking within about 48 hours of them leaving home. So these are young people who may have run away on their own, or young people um, who maybe feel like they can't come home for one reason or another, or are dealing with home situations where a parent says, well, I don't necessarily support who you are. You can't come home unless you follow my rules and the way we choose to live exactly. So sometimes we call those kids throwaway kids. They're not technically runaway kids. They would like to come home very much, but they may be dealing with difficult family circumstances where they're not able to go home. And a question that came in a moment ago was, what was the definition again of the sexually marginalized population? There's lots of different definitions of that. I was using that as a term for most often young people who identify as somewhere in the LGBTQIA community. That's most often what we're talking about here. So for here, and I dropped these quotes into the chat for you. So that for a really super duper quick overview for everybody, that's what we're talking about here. We mostly come in contact with sex trafficking victims, with labor trafficking victims, and then we have to talk about what do we do in the state to deal with that and to help with that. So our statewide structure, there's many different tendrils to this, many different aspects of this. But in the most basic part of this, we have a statewide council on human trafficking. And Department of Juvenile Justice sits on the statewide council, as well as many other state agencies and representatives from the governor's office, other elected officials. The statewide council on human trafficking meets and is chaired by the Office of the Attorney General and talks through some guidance and guidelines for what is the state of Florida going to do and what are the state of Florida's priorities going to be. And then at the more local level, we have human trafficking task forces. And the local Circuit 2, Leon County Human Trafficking Task Force is very heavily supported by Robin and the Survive and Thrive Advocacy Center. But there are many different human trafficking task forces all across the state of Florida. And everybody talks about different things in their task force. Everybody's task force is composed just a little bit differently. And if anybody would like to know how to get in contact with the local human trafficking task force in your particular area, I went ahead and dropped the link for that in the chat for you. Every task force usually has a couple different components. There's usually a law enforcement component for all the sworn law enforcement officers that are investigating human trafficking. There's usually a service provider piece of this to talk through what's available, what's needed for survivors of trafficking in the local area. And there may or may not be some other kinds of subgroups, but take a look at the link, see what the task forces are near you, and if you want to see what you can do in your local area to combat human trafficking, feel free to get in contact with that local task force. And then at the individual level, we have individual multidisciplinary team staffings, and those are for individual young people. These MDT staffings are typically for young people under the age of 18 whose trafficking is being investigated as a form of child abuse from the Department of Children and Families. And those are not open to the public. Nobody can just go to a multidisciplinary team staffing and say, I'd like to be part of the anti-trafficking fight in my area. Those are very specific to that individual child, and we have to be careful of that child's privacy and confidentiality. So from there, the statewide council publishes an annual report every single year to talk a little bit about what's going on within the state of Florida, what's happening with task forces, what are some of the interesting details that we have put out every single year. And the annual report from the Statewide Council on Human Trafficking, let me grab that for you. Annual report, Statewide Council on Human Trafficking. So the 2022 one has not been published just yet, but what I can do for you is throw you the link for the webpage on where it will be published. That particular webpage gets updated pretty frequently, and the 2022 report was just recently approved, so it should be published any day now. So, okay, now let's get into Juvenile Justice 101. We've hit the basics. We've hit what human trafficking is, what it looks like, what are some things going on in the state of Florida. Now, here's our flair on this. Here's what's going on the Department of Juvenile Justice side of things. So if you're working with survivors of trafficking, or you're working alongside child protection investigators, or working alongside the juvenile justice system, what is it we do? Who are we? What's going on with that? So just so everybody knows, juvenile justice in the state of Florida, we operate on a series of graduated sanctions. We are we are making interventions for young people more serious, the more risk that child presents. So, and we're talking about delinquency recidivism risk here. So if a young person presents a very low risk to reoffend, then for that particular young person, then we're going to provide much less intervention for that young person. If that person is presenting a higher risk to reoffend, then we're going to provide more intensive interventions for that young people. Everything is based on meeting that youth where they are and what risks they're presenting, and identifying what risk do they have and what do they need. Does this young person struggle with substance use? Does this person struggle with other challenges at home? Does this person struggle with impulsivity? What's going on with this young person? And we also recognize in juvenile justice that not every single type of behavior modification is going to require court intervention. There are plenty of young people who simply by the fact that they're involved in the juvenile justice system may very well have an experience that's enough for them. They'd rather not have to deal with any of us in the juvenile justice system. They would rather follow the rules and do what they have to do at home. So we have a continuum of different services, and young people typically start out eh, in our prevention divisions. And our prevention program area, we honestly, these young people aren't even really technically involved with the juvenile justice system. We're trying to keep them from getting involved with the juvenile justice system. There are numerous different kinds of prevention programs that are scattered across the entire state of Florida that are designed to work with young people from 5 years old to 18 years old and try to keep them from getting involved in juvenile justice in the first place. So maybe there's a mentoring program, maybe there's a big brother, big sister kind of program, maybe there's some other type of after school program located near you that's designed to work with young people that are presenting some risk factors that we don't want them to come into juvenile justice in the first place. So that all falls under the DJJ umbrella, but it's a way that we try and keep kids from coming into juvenile justice at all. And then every once in a while, a young person does come in the front doors of the juvenile detention centers. And so then they're served within the detention branch of the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice. Anybody who comes into a detention center is assigned a local juvenile probation officer, and that local juvenile probation officer is going to follow that young person throughout their entire time in the juvenile justice system. Whether they come in and they're out of the detention center and get a diversion program and we never see them again, they'll have a probation officer that's going to follow them and help guide them through the process. Most young people that come into detention are only in there for a matter of a few days. Occasionally young people are kept in there for a longer period of time, usually no longer than a couple of weeks. But honestly, most kids are in and out in a matter of days. Detention is designed to be short term and designed to simply make a quick determination if that young person needs to be taken off the streets for public safety or not, and can they be served in another way. So that moves into the community supervision side of things. So I mentioned the juvenile probation officers, right? The juvenile probation officers work within the realm of community supervision, and they're going to work with young people who have come into contact with the Department of Juvenile Justice, and these young people may or may not have come into the juvenile detention center. They may or may not need to be on probation or served in some other way by DJJ. But community supervision is one of the larger branches of the agency because so many young people are out and about in the community. And then for the young people that present a significant public safety risk and whose charges are quite severe, then they may very well need to be served within the Department of Juvenile Justice in one of our residential commitment programs. And these are more of a long-term placement scattered throughout the state that are designed to provide intensive treatments for that young person, intensive mental health, intensive substance abuse, intensive behavior modification, and help that person to go home, hopefully with a whole lot more knowledge and skills than they came into the residential commitment program. So Robin, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, somebody asked before you move from this slide,
Sure.
if you have a prevention resource list.
That is an excellent question, and you bet I do. If you give me just 1 second to grab it.
Okay, great. And I think everything's been clarified for the chat too, everybody.
Mhm.
If you choose everyone will see your chat And if you want to, in your Q&A, include the questions that you might have, we'll get to those at the end. Thank you.
Got it. Okay. And thanks, Robin, for talking for 2 seconds. It gave me just the amount of time I needed to grab the community resource guide. So I grabbed the DJJ community resource guide and dropped that into the chat. So if you're interested in finding some resources near you, feel free to use the interactive dashboard and see what is around and what's available in your particular area. So, all right, so back to this. So those covers the major 4 program areas within DJJ, our prevention, detention, community supervision, residential commitment. Young people sometimes move pretty fluidly between these different areas, depending on what their risks and needs are, and depending on what's going on with each individual charge that they may have picked up. So now let's talk about what about some of the new stuff? What about some of the updates? Now that we've talked a little bit about juvenile justice, we've hit human trafficking 101. Now let's talk about some of the updated details. So since 2020, so in 2020, DJJ updated our version of the human trafficking screening tool. So the human trafficking screening tool, we typically call it the HTST. The human trafficking screening tool is a tool that was jointly developed by Department of Juvenile Justice and Department of Children and Families to try and look for young people that may be experiencing exploitation, who maybe or maybe not don't want to tell us exactly what they've been through and what kind of exploitation they've been through. We did find through a study back in 2014, we found that if we simply ask young people if they've experienced human trafficking or if they've experienced commercial sexual exploitation, they're going to maybe look at us like we might be a little bit crazy and say no and move on, and then we're never really going to know. But one of the things that we did was create this screening tool. And on the Department of Juvenile Justice side of things, with that human trafficking screening tool, we're looking for possible indicators of trafficking for all the young people that are coming through the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice. So the young people maybe that are taken into custody and processed through a juvenile assessment center, or maybe the young people who pick up delinquency charges and who have to sit down and talk to and meet with a probation officer. Or any other young person that comes in contact with the Department of Juvenile Justice. And the Department of Children and Families, on the other side of this, are taking a look at the human trafficking screening tools that we're completing and then handing over to Department of Children and Families, their child protection teams, to finish. Or they're using the human trafficking screening tools all on their own, because DCF, the Department of Children and Families, they operate the Florida Child Abuse Hotline in the state of Florida, which, in case you don't know what it is, 1-800-96-ABUSE. And every adult in the state of Florida is a mandatory reporter. So if you think you might be coming across a young person, a child who may very well be experiencing human trafficking, please pick up the phone, call 1-800-96-ABUSE, or go online to the DCF website and submit an online child abuse report. Sorry, had to make a plug for that. You can't talk about child abuse and human trafficking in the state of Florida and not give the information on who to call. So back to the HTST. So we made some updates to the human trafficking screening tool in 2020 to see if we could minimize the number of times that kids were interviewed, see if we could pick up on some quick and easy red flags right off the bat that were flagging kids as potential human trafficking victims. So some of the things we did was we established, we took a look at the different charges that young people were coming in on. And back in the day, before 2016, if an individual under the age of 18 was engaging in some kind of commercial sex, that young person could be charged with the crime of prostitution. But after 2016, the legislature passed some legislation that said, no, we're not going to do this anymore. We recognize that individuals under the age of 18 who are engaged in the commercial sex industry, we realize that those people are victims of crimes. They're the victim of a crime of human trafficking, and we're going to treat them as child abuse victims, the way they should be treated. So back in the day, we looked for young people who were coming in the front door with a charge of prostitution, but we weren't really seeing that often. And we were, whoops, oh, here we go. Okay. So we weren't seeing that very often. And after 2016, we weren't really seeing that at all, except for the occasional mistake somewhere that somebody hadn't gotten a memo that you can't charge a young person with the crime of prostitution. And so we said, well, what are some of the other things that we need to look for? There's the crime of prostitution. We're already looking for young people who maybe have experienced sexual abuse. We're looking for young people that have run away multiple times. We know that there's some significant correlations between runaway behavior and sexual abuse that that may very well lead someone to a trafficking history. But what else is there? What about some of these young people that are coming in the front door that maybe have a whole lot of different 3 or 4 cell phones and a whole lot of money, and they can't really explain where this all comes from? Or what about the kids who are coming in that have tattoos that when they talk about what the tattoos mean and the parents tell us what the tattoos mean, those two things really don't line up, and we can't figure out who exactly is the person who did the tattoo on this young person. So we broadened our horizons just a little bit, and we started looking for young people who are picking up some charges that we often refer to as masking charges, or charges that a young person might come in the front door with that may not say human trafficking in the name of the charge, but if you peel back the onion a little bit and you look at the circumstances behind the charge, then maybe that might be a young person who's experiencing trafficking. A classic example on that one is any young person coming in the front door uh, who's been taken into custody. So any person who has been taken into custody and comes in the front door that's coming off a runaway incident, or a young person that has absconded from probation supervision and is coming in the front door on an order to take into custody, or a young person that comes in on a charge of providing a false identification to a law enforcement officer. Some of those different things that may show up as different charges when a young person comes in the front door, we're taking a look at those charges and taking a look at some of the other items that go along with it, and seeing if there's if that young person is someone that may very well need a human trafficking screening tool. So yeah, do you have something, Robin?
Yeah, I got a question here. Someone asked who normally is allowed to complete these screenings with you? And then I have another
Mhm.
question after you answer that one.
Sure. So the first one, oh, and I just saw, Robin, thank you so much for posting the website for the Florida Child Abuse Hotline. That's excellent. So the question on who is completing these screenings with young people, that is, well, that's a great question. So there's a couple different groups of people that are completing these screenings. So the human trafficking screening tool on the DJJ side of things is done by our juvenile probation officers and individuals who are screening young people at our juvenile assessment centers 24 hours a day. We call them the JACs, Juvenile Assessment Centers. And every probation officer is trained every year in how to deliver the human trafficking screening tool and updates to new information that we get on human trafficking. And on the DCF side of things, then the human trafficking screening tool is completed by the child protection investigators who have some extra special training in how to work with young people who've experienced human trafficking. And so they have a little bit more training, and they're looking to really try to make that determination based on the evidence in front of them, based on the investigative tools that they have. Can they go ahead and make that call? Can they make that call and say that, yes, this child is a verified victim of human trafficking? Or maybe there's some evidence, but not quite enough to really prove it. So maybe that child has some evidence, but you can't prove it, so they might close that case as not substantiated. Or maybe they're unable to find evidence at all, and they may close that case as no findings. So on the DCF side of things, the specially trained child protection investigators administer the HTST. On the DJJ side of things, our juvenile probation officers and screeners complete the HTST. And there's a few contracted providers who also do the HTST on the DJJ side of things.
Great, great. Thank you. And the other
Mhm.
question I have, and this is coming from just having seen a webinar on sort of the overlap between sex trafficking and labor trafficking,
Mhm.
is the consideration of forced criminality as a form of labor trafficking, specifically when you see gangs as the traffickers.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking about that as just huge red flags, right? If somebody comes to the attention of DJJ
Mhm.
and there's some sort of gang involvement, and it
Mhm.
was either an initiation requirement or whatever it is that that person
Mhm.
commit certain crimes, that should be a big red flag, right?
Absolutely. There's a whole host of red flags that we look for, and like I said, every single probation officer every year gets this training on the human trafficking screening tool and updates on what's new in the world of human trafficking and the forced criminality and gang trafficking. Those are things that are a little bit newer, and that we try to keep our probation officers well apprised of. And I will say that one of the foremost and premier experts on labor trafficking of juveniles and some of the newer aspects of it, including forced criminality, one of the absolute nationwide leading experts on that actually is right here within the state of Florida and works for DCF. So if any of you have an opportunity to attend a labor trafficking training or forced criminality training with Sue Abelhausen, who works for the Department of Children and Families, I would strongly recommend that you jump on that webinar, take that class, show up and listen to her. She is a wealth of knowledge for labor trafficking and forced criminality. And let's be honest, she's a wealth of knowledge for everything else related to human trafficking as well. But that's a particular specialty of hers, and it's fascinating to listen to her.
Oh my gosh, I think that sounds great. And my guess is based on the questions and people who are saying what they do and who they are. Can we get information about Sue and put it in the website or wherever DCF posts its training, or is it just internal
Mhm.
trainings at DCF?
DCF does plenty of external trainings, and they do internal trainings. And
Sure,
and
sure.
I'm seeing in the chat, I'm seeing the love for Sue in the
Yeah,
chat. I know,
yeah,
right? She's
yeah.
amazing.
Okay.
Um, and I would even say if Robin, I know that we have these training events every single month. If you could manage to snag her for one of these events to do labor trafficking, I would recommend snag her.
You know what? And I'll just do another commercial going back to the very beginning is that for our next BB meeting, they are trying to find someone to speak on an issue here locally. Is she based here in Tallahassee?
No,
Oh,
Sue is based in the Orlando area. She works on the DCF Human Trafficking Prevention Team. And the DCF Human Trafficking Prevention Team, their lead person who is based right here in Tallahassee. My colleague who I work with all the time is Katia Kunin. And Katia has a dynamic team that's scattered throughout the state. There's Marina Anderson, who covers the north, Sue Abelhausen, who covers most of the central, and then the newest member of DCF's team, Alejandra Kennedy, who covers the southernmost part of the state of Florida. All of them
oh.
are experts. All of them are wonderful.
Let me do this and just and thank you for saying that because we might have
Mhm.
people on today who don't know of these wonderful members of this team. We love Marina. She has presented
Mhm.
here a lot, and thanks. We'll be in touch with Sue, everybody. So thank you. And yes, there's
Yes.
love for you, Catherine. You're awesome
Yeah.
too.
Oh,
Yay.
great.
Thank
Oh,
you.
yay. Okay. Well, I know that person. I know that person from DJJ, so they might be a little bit biased there. But but that's okay. I'll take it. So thank you. We love you too. Um, so let's see. Here we go. So let me look at some numbers. I saw another question that came in about tattoos. I'm going to come back to that 1 second. So one of the things to know is we screen a lot of kids in DJJ. So as I mentioned, any kid coming in the front door through a juvenile assessment center, we're at least going to take a look at our pre-screening, take a look at those immediate red flags. What are the charges the young person's coming in on? Is there somebody telling us that this kid might be trafficked? Do they have too many cell phones, not enough possessions? What's going on with this young person? And then if we identify that, then we're going to go forward and do the entire human trafficking screening tool conversation. And it's a semi-structured interview. We use an interview guide to make sure that we haven't missed any of the critical aspects of human trafficking, but it's not really a questionnaire that we hand the young person and say, answer all these questions about what you've been through in your life. We don't really do that. We do the human trafficking screening tool through an interactive conversation process, and we take notes on our tools to make sure we haven't missed anything, and then go back to the computer and start checking the boxes and filling in the blanks. So the whole thing is done through a conversation. It's not a questionnaire. And at the end of the day, last fiscal year, we administered 9,129 full human trafficking screening tools. So they made it beyond that quick pre-screen. Do we need to do a tool or not? And that corresponded with 4,816 young people. So some young people get screened more than once. Some young people are taken into custody and processed through juvenile assessment centers and detention centers more than once. But we did 9,129 full tools. And the breakdowns on it, we do them for about 66%. It's almost exactly 2/3 and 1/3. 66% male youth and about 33% female youth. And you might look at that and think, huh, well, that's interesting. I thought trafficking was something that was more specific to young girls or young female youth. Well, not necessarily. There's plenty more young people who are males who are trafficked than we even really recognize. The number that comes out of DCF as far as trafficking investigations every year is somewhere between 13 and 15% of the verified victims are male victims. And you think about it, most of the young people that are coming through the Department of Juvenile Justice are predominantly young male youth, and young male youth have plenty of risk factors for human trafficking. It's not just our girls. So let me come back over here. So some of the updates we've done since 2020, now since 2020, the new training requirements just went into effect in 2022. But last time I did this particular training was 2020. But since 2022, we now require that human trafficking training is given to anyone who is going to have direct contact with a young person. We've required for years that any juvenile probation officer, especially a juvenile probation officer who's going to be doing the human trafficking screening tool, but now we require that everyone gets HT training. So if you're going to have direct contact with a young person in a contracted provider or have direct contact with a young person in some other capacity other than a probation officer, everybody gets human trafficking training now when they first come on board. And our juvenile probation officers still do HTST training every single year. And that was a triumph that we were pretty proud of, that we wanted to make sure that anybody who's going to work with young people, that they've got some basic knowledge and some basic training on this. And in order to make it simple and easy for our folks, we made sure that we did the training and we made it available online so that our staff people were able to, whoops, come on, help me out here. Okay, so their staff people were able to get it and get it quickly, even if we couldn't get them into a face-to-face class right away. So our probation officers are getting training face-to-face or sometimes virtually, depending on travel constraints, but there's an online training available for other people. And then also we have some upcoming updates to the human trafficking screening tool. This is a living document. This is a living conversation. We always want to try to be a little bit better, figure out what's the new thing going on, what's the new language that the young people are using, what are the new apps that the young people are using. You know, I used to have pretty dark hair, but it's getting pretty salty over the years, so I can no longer even claim to be a young person. So I have to learn what the kids these days are doing, and I have to try and stay on top of it. And so we have to make sure that our screening tools and our information is relevant for the young people that are doing this. And so we also, quite frankly, we would like to clear up some of the misperceptions on the human trafficking screening tool as well, that some folks think that we hand the human trafficking screening tool to the young person and say, here, answer these questions that are, quite difficult and quite invasive about their history. And that's not the way this is done. That's not the way it's done in the Department of Juvenile Justice. It's not the way it's done in the Department of Children and Families. It's done through a structured interview process. But if we can tweak the tool to make it a little bit easier for everyone to understand and tweak our training to help people get good interview skills, all of our probation officers are trained in motivational interviewing. If we can update everybody's skills to better deliver the human trafficking screening tool and have these conversations and gather usable information that we can pass on to the Department of Children and Families to do the child abuse investigations, if we can do this better, we're going to do this better. And so we're taking another look at the HTST and our HTST training to see if we can put forth some improvements on this. So let's see. So let me come on to the next one. So that will take us right down to the end. We have some updated training. We have updated HTST data. And I will come back to that tattoo question for just a moment. The question was, are there any particular tattoos that we look for, or any particular things that we're trying to figure out? The answer to that question, which quite frankly, the answer to most questions is yes, no, kind of, sort of. Anybody who knows me knows that that's how I'm going to answer a question, because there are very few questions that are able to be answered by a simple yes or a simple no. But the details and the information, the nuance to that answer is, sure, sometimes there are tattoos that are very specifically related to trafficking. Can I give you a list of them? Not necessarily, because what might be relevant to tattoos in one part of the state or one part of the country may very well not be relevant to trafficking going on in another part of the state or another part of the country. In some areas of the state and in some particular neighborhoods even, it's very common to see trafficking victims who have the name of a trafficker tattooed to that young person. That may be something that's really common to see in that area. In another area of the state, it may not be very common. They may have a different kind of symbol or a different kind of placement of a symbol somewhere on that. So the key with that, when we're teaching people to ask about tattoos and teaching people about human trafficking related tattoos, we're asking people to ask the young person, what is that tattoo? What does it mean? How did you get that? Where did you get that? Who was with you when you got it? Who paid for it? And to maybe have some follow-up conversations with the young person's parents or guardians to see, okay, if that person has a name maybe on a collarbone, or has a name on a forearm, or something like that, and that young person tells us that name that they have on their collarbone, as I point to my forearm, I do know the parts of my body, so we're going to go with forearm. So if that name that the young person has on their forearm, if the young person says that that correlates to a cousin who passed away the year before, okay, does the parent say the same thing? Does the name correlate to a cousin who passed away the year before? Or does that parent say, I don't know what on earth that child is saying to you. That is not a cousin who passed away a year ago. That name that's tattooed to that on that young person's arm is the name of that young person's significant other. And I wish they didn't have that tattoo, and the significant other took them to get that tattoo, and we don't even like that tattoo. So tattoos are very individual, and the best way to ask about if a tattoo is related to human trafficking is really to figure out, is it or is it not? The only way to find that out is to ask the young person. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and I see the questions starting to come in fast and furious. So I'm happy to answer some questions, and then let's have a conversation. So let me stop sharing, move this on over, and see what I've got coming in on chat. So
Yeah,
question.
question again about the human trafficking assessment tools,
Sure.
and you already, you indicated not just law enforcement, but includes
Mhm.
law enforcement. I know here also at the Florida Network of Youth and Family
Mhm.
Services talk about the various shelters around the state.
Mhm.
Staff there
Mhm.
use the tool. Sometimes they may not be able to get through the whole tool, but they definitely can use it, right?
Yeah, the folks that are within the Florida Network of Youth and Family Services, the different runaway shelters, they all fall under our umbrella of prevention services, because you want to have a safe place for a young person to go. You want to try and keep them from going into the detention centers, and try to keep them from getting involved in in the delinquency system, the runaway shelters and other services available for children in need of services or families in need of services, those are critical components in trying to keep kids out of delinquency. So yeah, the shelters use the human trafficking screening tool. There's a couple of other contracted individuals that use the human trafficking screening tool. It's not something that just anybody can use. It's something that you need to have some special training. You need to have some training provided by somebody who is qualified to do that training. And you have to be operating in particular contexts. And if there's anybody in the audience here that's thinking, well, maybe my organization would be a good one to do human trafficking screening, or how do we get access to the tool, or how do we use the tool, or would it make sense for my organization to use the tool, just back channel me, reach out, contact me, send me an email, give me a call, something like that. We can talk through that offline and see if that would make sense for your organization or not.
And it sounds like that might be the case with this questioner who said, can it be used by other professions such as counselors and therapists? And maybe this could be a good time to mention some of the other screening tools. Like, I know that over time, we don't have like a validated, perfect screening tool for adults of sex or labor trafficking. But for youth, it seems like someone had done a study and sort of reduced a screening for the world at large to 5 basic questions that you can know about. Do you have any information about those screening tools that counselors and therapists might use?
Yeah, there's lots of screening tools that are out there, and all of them really just have very different purposes. So the tools that are out there are really going to depend on what are your particular needs and what are you looking for. So one of the reasons that we in Florida decided to develop the human trafficking screening tool was because we took a look at the different tools that were out there, and what is this one good for? What is that one good for? What's the primary population of this one or that one? And we took a look and said, well, you know what? We really want a screening tool that asks questions that are good for male youth and female youth. Some tools are only designed to be used with one or the other. And our data collection actually captures young people according to their sex assigned at birth. So our screening tool at the moment is only capturing that particular sex data point. But we wanted a tool as well that asks questions about sexual exploitation, commercial sexual exploitation, and also ask questions about labor trafficking and labor exploitation. So we wanted to make sure that our tool covered a broader range of individuals and that it covered both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And so the other tools that are out there, which there's plenty of really interesting and useful tools that might help you get to an answer on maybe this person might be experiencing exploitation or not. But we wanted to make sure that ours was as broad-based as possible.
Yeah, so you might have counselors or others like in an emergency room, or a social worker might not need the same kind of data that you obviously have. So, so yeah, there's more information out there on there. I think some of the trusted places include the Office of Victims of Crime have a whole lot of information about trafficking. SOAR, SOAR is a great training on trafficking. I'm also meaning to talk about HELP. Or HEAL, gosh, it's Friday, the HEAL trafficking website. And I can put that information up, especially those of you who are clinicians of any kind, both medical, mental health professionals. If you don't know about the HEAL trafficking organization, you should. They're great. And you can get a lot of information there, and really be careful, because people might have tools out there that really are not the best and the most reliable. So, so thanks. Okay, great, great. We got a question about certificates. Just to remind you all, USF will send them out to you to the email that you used when you signed up to join and be part of this program today.
Excellent. And I just threw a link in the chat to the webpage where DCFs annual reports on human trafficking are posted, and there's different reports from different years going all the way back to 2012, 2013. I actually just tried the link for the report that was just posted and just came out, oh gosh, just a few weeks ago. And it looks like the new button is there, that the new report for 21-22 is out. But I clicked on that link and it doesn't look like that link works at this moment. So stand by. I'm sure DCF will be updating that particular link in the near future, but I at least dropped you the link for where you can get it. So if you want to save that or bookmark it, so that if you want to go pull out some information on DCF services and what they do for human trafficking and the various services and stats about details, that's all up there.
If somebody was able
Oh,
to
thank
open it,
you.
so that's good. And also, Graciela, thank you. Graciela Marquina, our community services advocate, posted the healtrafficking.org website. Just go and noodle around on there, everybody, especially if you're, as I said, a clinician, mental or physical health, dentist, anybody. So much great information. Thank you. Thank you. Great. Okay. Okay, good.
Yeah.
We also had a question about how are children who identify differently from their birth gender placed in safe house locations?
Yeah, that's another great question. And I think some of that really goes back to not every person is going to need a safe house. So I just want to come back to that real quick, because when we're talking about young people who've experienced trafficking, there's a whole host of different services that are available to them. And some of them are available right there in their home community where they don't even need to go anywhere from home. They can receive services right there at home. Then they may very well need to go to a foster home placement with some foster parents that have some extra training on working with young people who've experienced exploitation. And then they may need to go to a particular type of group home, perhaps for young people who are maybe at risk of trafficking, or they may very well need to go to a more intensive mental health placement if they have more intensive needs that need to be addressed, that are a bit more intense than a CSEC safe house might be able to accommodate. So there's a whole host of different options that the multidisciplinary team staffing process will help with a young person to figure out if they need to go somewhere, and if so, what type of service are they going to need. And each one of the different safe houses operates just a little bit differently. They work, they're scattered in different parts all throughout the state of Florida, and they have different types of admissions criteria, or they work really well with young people who have experienced one type of trafficking or another. And we have to make sure that we are all very careful with where the young people are placed, simply because you don't necessarily want to put two people in the same safe house that maybe are from the exact same area of the state, and maybe were involved in trafficking together at the same time in the same neighborhood, maybe with the same trafficker. So all those things are different nuances that go into how and where young people are placed. So there's a ton of different details on that, and every safe house is just a little bit different. And so specifically, to answer questions on where young people are placed who identify differently, it's really going to depend on that individual young person and what their particular needs are and what's going on with the different safe houses around the state, so that that particular survivor's needs are best accounted for.
Great, thank you. As more questions might come in, I have a question for you, and I
Sure.
appreciate you giving the data. And one of them related to the percentage, the genders of the founded cases at DCF being skewed female, and the
Mhm,
DCF identified cases skewing male by
mhm.
kind of a significant amount. So how do you think about that? What conversations have you had to, just say, why is there a difference?
I'm not so sure I understand the question. That the percentages of male victims is increasing over time. Is it that or something different?
I thought I heard you say, and forgive me if I got it wrong,
Mhm,
but that the DCF identifies maybe 13 to 19% of the
mhm,
cases
mhm,
that they have on founded cases are male. but that through the DJJ screening tool that more males are identified, or that's in my
Oh,
mind,
mhm,
I'm kind
mhm.
of making a equivalent, this could be wrong, that founded in DCF and identified in DJJ might be two different terms, but
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for clarifying. No, and I'm happy to clarify that point. So the numbers I was talking about for DJJ are the proportions and percentages of young people that we screen. So we're looking for all kinds of different things. Uh, so we're looking for young people coming into the front door on particular types of charges, or young people that have other types of risk factors. And frankly, in some ways, just as a volume of numbers, we encounter a lot more male youth than we do female youth every day. So we're going to be looking at more male youth every day than female youth,
Mhm.
but we wanted to make sure and I want to put a finer point on this. We wanted to make sure that all the young people coming through the front door were really looked at as possible trafficking victims. We wanted to make sure that everybody, their charges were looked at, and what they came in the front door with at the Juvenile Assessment Center was looked at. And we wanted to help all of our screeners and all of our probation officers to think beyond, oh, sex trafficking must be a girl, or labor trafficking must be a boy. We wanted to help guide them into thinking about that for every young person that comes across their desk. So a young male youth that might come across their desk who has a charge of fake ID to a law enforcement officer. We
Mhm.
wanted to help that probation officer to think, oh, well, that could be a human trafficking related charge. The same way that they might think a young female youth coming across their desk with a charge of false ID to a law enforcement officer, they might think, oh, why does that kid have a fake ID? Why does that girl have a fake ID? We wanted to help guide them into thinking about some of these things,
Mhm.
regardless of the sex or gender of the young person that's in front of them.
Okay. Okay. All right. That's definitely, it's like two different worlds. And it's more like, it's not even apples and oranges. It's like apples and like, I don't know, sweet potatoes or something. Um,
Yeah, there we go. They're all
okay.
vegetables. I'm happy with it.
So, somebody asked, what are some of the laws and or policies being worked on currently to assist in the prevention of human trafficking, specifically involving youth? And what I'd like to do right away before you can start, but I wanted to put up the resource I mentioned at the top, which is the toolkit that we just finished developing on how youth and caregivers can speak to one another. And that could be any adult really that's working with youth. Want to give a shout out to Jamie Rossland, who helped us with this, as well as Graciela and a team here, Salter Mitchell PR. We developed this to be a tool that you could use, you as an adult, even if you're not related to that youth, are talking to them. So we get information from local organizations like unhoused shelters here where youth and where caregivers and youth were living. We got information from youth specific programs. So we interviewed youth to get the information that we put in these toolkits, but they're there for youth to talk to youth about trafficking, i.e. prevent it, to your point, to your question, about youth and caregivers talking to one another, both youth to talk to caregivers and caregivers to talk to youth about what is human trafficking, what it isn't, kind of to stay involved with youth, especially on their online worlds. As a caregiver, if you are kind of just saying, I can't, it's too much, I can't really understand everything that they're doing online, strongly encouraging you to get online with your, your nieces, nephews. If you're in a counseling program at a school or in any of the other programs that are attending today, understand really the world that they live in so that you can do the prevention work that might be able to, as well as identify and intervene if necessary. So Katherine, it looks like you put a couple more good
Mhm.
resources there.
Sure did. I grabbed the information posted for the Florida Department of Education. So within the Florida Department of Education, thanks to some tireless work from the teams within the Florida Department of Education, and I have to go ahead and specifically name drop Ms. Michelle Gaines, who has done some incredible anti-trafficking work over the years.
Forever.
Um, so for Department of Education, every single individual school district, everyone is required to include some information about trafficking and risks and some educational materials. Everyone is required to include that for young people. And so if you're looking around thinking, well, gosh, what do we do in my particular area of the state? What's going on in my particular school district? What are we doing to help educate young people about trafficking within the school settings to try and prevent trafficking as young as possible? I dropped a link in the chat about where you can go to look up the information that Department of Education posts on their website, but also specifically how you can look up your particular school district and what your particular school district's plan is. So I dropped those both in the chat. Feel free, go grab it, go look it up.
And can I say, we tried to
Sure.
do that for all of the counties in our area,
Hmm.
and it is a hard thing. There is not the
Yep.
compliance that I would like to see. I'll just be really, really frank with you. It's hard to find. Sometimes it's buried in health education, not buried, but
Hmm.
really you can't find it. It's buried. I guess that makes it feel buried to me. It might be there. There might be stuff going on, but the DOE, I thought, was pretty clear on what they're supposed to do. And a lot of you, I could tell from your questions, you're very active, you're very interested and involved. And if you want to find out more about how youth can see some prevention happening in your
Hmm.
local area, call your county school administrator's office and say, I'd like to see your human trafficking plan that
Hmm.
DOE requires you do. Just ask them. You're a citizen, you're paying taxes to get that done, right?
Hmm.
So I will just put that out there. We're getting close to the end. I have a couple more questions I want to get your wisdom on, please,
Hmm.
Katherine. Is there any evidence about how the rise of street fentanyl affect youths being trafficked? And it's reminding me of what happened, when we were looking at Oxy, and what is the intersectionality between, Oxy, cotton abuse, and all of the, what happened with those addiction levels. Fentanyl is a whole another class of dangerous drugs. But you see any correlation, any connections?
Well, the answer to everything is always yes, no, kind of, sort of, right? So,
Mhm.
yes, we are seeing street fentanyl that's out there. Yes, we're seeing other substances that are out there, but we keep coming back to what is this young person's vulnerability, right? So if that young person is struggling with some kind of a substance addiction or struggling with inability to obtain their own prescription medication for something that they need, and they're now self-medicating through other kinds of less legal ways. All those things are different things that create vulnerability and create the opportunity for an individual to be exploited. So sure, yes, there is fentanyl that's out there on the streets. And yes, sure, there is plenty of other illegal drugs that are out there on the streets. And the drug that we're talking about today is fentanyl. Before, we were talking about opioids. Before that, we were talking about cocaine and crack. And pick a drug, pick a year. The particular drugs come and go. The ones that are of most concern at the moment tend to come and go. But what they do to that young person by creating that vulnerability, that is what we're most focused on, that young person is experiencing more vulnerability.
Exactly. Well, we're getting to the end of our program. We do have a question about, and I just want to answer the question. This is about, probably news stories about whether the Martha's Vineyard stuff was trafficking. I don't know. I am really focused on what is trafficking, what meets the legal definition of trafficking. People who are trafficked, we are here to help. So I like seeing human trafficking being pulled out of the political sphere and put into the services sphere. So I'm going to leave that question at that. I'd also like to let you all know that we are going to have our next program on November the 18th. And just as a teaser, I've spoken with the person who's in charge of the City of Houston Mayor's office on the intersection of human trafficking and disasters. You might know the City of Houston just went through the roof in terms of its amazing work after Hurricane Harvey. We certainly, with Hurricane Ian, are suffering mightily in Southwest Florida. We can use that information, but we're still in hurricane season. So, and natural disasters any kind of crisis is really a field day for traffickers, and we need to stay focused. So I want to hope that you'll all join us also next month. Katherine, thank you so much again for all you do. Thank you everybody for your kind words and for joining us today. And somebody asked too about, can we get the links to the chat? And Chris and Laura, I'm going to just ask you, I know you can give us kind of a transcript of these. Could we pull them out, or what? How can
Sure,
we give people the links, all the links that were in the chat?
I have them teed up. I can hand them all over to you, Robin, and we can send them out with certificates or anything like that. I have them all
Okay.
teed up and ready.
Let's do this. Katherine's going to send all those links. I'm going to make sure they get posted on the Stack website along with this recording and with the PowerPoint. Okay. All right. All right. We'll be able to get all the information in your hands. Everybody, thank you. We look forward to seeing you in a month. Thank you, USF. You have been the best, and we can't really express our gratitude more to you, and we are grateful. Chris, Laura, Senator Daniel, for all the times you have been there for us. You've done this for us for free for all these years, and we hope we can keep working with you. We hope you'll reincarnate. This may be our last program together, but just to you for all of your generosity and for all the information you got to share to thousands and thousands of people.